Imagine waking up in your bed in the dead of night. The room is pitch black, maybe just lit by a grainy, fisheye distortion of moonlight coming through the blinds. You tell your body to sit up, but nothing happens. You're completely, utterly paralyzed. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive right into one of the most terrifying glitches of the human mind. Yep, we're talking about sleep paralysis. Just feel that visceral panic setting in for a second. Your brain is suddenly woken up, right? But your body, it's entirely dead to the world. You might hear this low buzzing starting to fill your ears, literally vibrating inside your skull. As your eyes dart around, frantically trying to make sense of the dark, it feels like a camera is just slowly zooming into the darkest corners of your bedroom. It builds this unbearable, mounting tension. You're awake, but you are literally a prisoner in your own flesh. And then the physical sensations kick in. You have to ask yourself, what is that terrifying, crushing pressure that's suddenly pushing down on your chest? Honestly, it feels like an immense, suffocating weight has just curled right on top of you, holding your ribs down so tightly that you can barely even draw a breath. And just as you realize you're suffocating, you hear a sudden, sharp creak echoing right beside your bed. Someone or something is in the room with you. At this point, your heart is just pounding out of your chest. This is the absolute peak of the horror. In your mind, you're thrashing, you're fighting, you're doing everything you possibly can to call for help. You try to scream, you try to cry out to literally whoever might be listening, but your lips refuse to part. Your vocal cords are just frozen solid. And right at the very edge of your peripheral vision, these shadowy humanoid figures seem to shift and glide through the darkness. Section 1. Shadow Men and Demons. Let's take a collective breath for a second, because as isolating as that first-person experience feels, you are definitely not alone. Okay, let's dive into this. Humans have actually documented this exact sensation for centuries. Listen to how beautifully and, well, horribly, Ernest Hemingway described this in his story, The Snows of Kilimanjaro. He wrote, "Its weight was all upon his chest, and while it crouched there, he could not move or speak." I mean, wow. That just brilliantly illustrates how universal this feeling of a beast or an entity crouching on your chest truly is. It's kind of this dark equalizer among sleepers all across the globe. Because this phenomenon is just so universally terrifying, different cultures throughout history have desperately tried to make sense of these hallucinations using the folklore of their specific time. Historically, folks have blamed demonic assaults, witchcraft, and, more recently, space alien abductions. Actually, fun fact, the very word nightmare literally comes from the Nordic folklore of the Mara. That was a supernatural creature that would supposedly visit sleepers and sit directly on their chests to suffocate them. Now, in our modern era, this folklore has evolved into a very specific, widely reported shadow figure known as the Hat Man. He's usually described as this shadowy silhouette wearing a fedora or some kind of brimmed hat, and witnesses claim that even though he completely lacks discernible facial features, they can vividly feel him staring directly at them, usually right from the corner of the room. Interestingly enough, clinical reports frequently link the appearance of these distinct shadow people to intense sleep deprivation. Art has also been profoundly shaped by these midnight terrors. Just take Henry Fuseli's incredibly famous 1781 painting, The Nightmare. It perfectly captures the medical symptoms way before we even had the science to explain them. Notice the paralyzed woman lying in a supine position, flat on her back, with an incubus sitting squarely on her chest, while this super creepy, ghostly horse just peers right through the curtains. Section 2. The Science of the Freeze. It's time to kind of turn on the lights in this dark room, take a deep breath, and use a much calmer, clinical lens to look at what's actually happening here. We're going to strip away the demons, the aliens, and the shadows, and look at the fascinating biology behind the terror. So the secret here lies in a biological mechanism called muscle atonia. Now, this is a completely natural, highly protective state that happens during REM sleep. Basically, to prevent you from getting up and physically acting out your dreams, which, let's face it, could be incredibly dangerous, your brain temporarily paralyzes your voluntary muscles using specific neurotransmitters. Sleep paralysis happens when there's essentially a glitch in the matrix. Your brain regains waking consciousness, but that protective biological freeze, it's still actively locking your body down. Let's look at the timeline of a normal sleep cycle to see how this works. When you go to bed, you cycle through 3 stages of non-REM sleep before finally hitting REM sleep, which is where all the dreaming and that muscle atonia we just talked about occur. Typically, you enter this REM stage within an hour or so of falling asleep. But when your transition out of REM sleep gets fragmented, well, you can wake up mentally while the physical paralysis of REM sleep hasn't actually been turned off yet. But what about the shadows and the buzzing sounds? Well, researchers actually categorize these intense, hyperreal hallucinations into three specific types. First, the intruder hallucination. That's that overwhelming sense of an evil presence, or those shadow figures we mentioned earlier. Second is the incubus hallucination, which causes that crushing, suffocating chest pressure. And third, vestibular motor hallucinations, which create these illusory feelings of moving, flying, or even floating entirely out of your body. Because your brain is still partially in a dream state while your eyes are wide open, it literally overlays these nightmares directly onto your real-world environment. Section 3. The narcolepsy connection. So, who exactly experiences this terrifying glitch? Let's take a look at the data. Extensive clinical research, like the really detailed systematic reviews published in Sleep Medicine Reviews, have rigorously investigated the variables that drive both the frequency and the intensity of these episodes. By analyzing thousands of cases globally, researchers have been able to pinpoint the exact risk factors that make these midnight traps a lot more likely to spring on you. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the contrast here. On one hand, you have occasional, isolated episodes that happen to everyday people right upon waking. But on the other hand, for people with narcolepsy, the brain has immense difficulty controlling its sleep-wake cycles. So instead of entering REM sleep after an hour, they can slip rapidly into REM sleep almost immediately upon falling asleep. This means they often experience the paralysis just as they're drifting off, rather than when they're waking up. Even if you don't have narcolepsy, certain triggers definitely make an attack far more likely. Disrupted sleep patterns and jet lag are huge culprits here. But there's also a powerful psychiatric link. People with panic disorders and PTSD experience this at much, much higher rates. In fact, clinical evidence suggests a fascinating, albeit super dark, link where PTSD flashbacks might actually manifest directly as these terrifying hallucinations during a sleep paralysis episode. And on a purely physical level, simply sleeping in the supine position, meaning flat on your back, drastically increases your chances of triggering an episode. Section 4. Breaking the spell. Safe ways to wake up. If you do find yourself trapped, I want to reassure you right now. The condition is fundamentally harmless, and there are proven, safe ways to fight back. Clinical psychology actually offers a highly effective cognitive behavioral approach if you ever wake up paralyzed. First is reassessment. You have to tell your brain logically that this is just a temporary biological glitch. Second is emotional distancing. You really have to recognize that panic feeds the hallucinations. Actually, fighting the paralysis with physical force makes that incubus hallucination feel even heavier. And finally, inward meditation. Try to focus entirely on a positive memory or a prayer, purposefully taking your attention completely away from the shadowy corners of the room until the paralysis naturally fades. And if you want to keep the shadows at bay entirely, health services like the NHS recommend some incredibly practical, everyday prevention habits. Aim for a solid 7 to 9 hours of sleep. Try to maintain a rigid, consistent bedtime schedule to keep your internal clock happy. Practice sleeping on your side instead of your back. And definitely avoid alcohol and caffeine right before bed, because those severely disrupt your REM cycles. So the crucial point is this absolute cruel irony. The very biological mechanism that evolution designed to act as a shield, to keep us perfectly safe and completely still while we dream, can misfire and create our absolute greatest source of conscious terror. It is literally our own brilliant biology turning against us in the dark. Understanding the science definitely strips away the supernatural element, but honestly, it doesn't entirely erase that primal, visceral fear of being a prisoner in your own bed. So I'm going to leave you with this thought to chew on. The next time your eyes snap open in the dead of night, and that heavy, electric silence completely fills the room, and you suddenly realize you cannot move a single muscle, what will you see waiting for you in the dark?